All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you the best realtor in PUL. He's with Keller Williams. He's been doing a long time. One of the most intelligent realtors you'll ever meet. So you're not just dealing with somebody that can put something on the MLS and wait for action. You've got an intelligent person that can calculate different trends in the market, make sure that your property gets out there, and will do what it needs to sell. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rick the Fuhrmanator Fuhrman.
That was good. That was more than I expected. Thank you, Amanda. Now I'm a little embarrassed. I am pinch hitting today for Kevin because he is in Arkansas, and they have a great special, so make sure to call Megan on that. Today I'm going to give a rendition of the first presentation I did on environmental concerns in real estate, and this is going to be more pointed towards your home. So this is hopefully going to be a little more pointed and interesting than the last one if you had a chance to listen to it. Whether you rent a home or buy a home, there are always possibilities that you can be exposed to some kind of environmental concern, and I'm going to bring some of those things up today. The first thing I want to talk about is this little paper right here. This is lovingly in our industry called the Form 17, or the Seller Disclosure Statement for Improved Property. And I imagine that you probably are the last one that bought a house, so you had to look at this and you had to sign it. And what this is this is an allowance for the owner of the property to tell you as the buyer what happened to this property during the time that they owned it. And it's pretty detailed, and it lets them relieve their responsibilities. So if there was something that happened on the property, like maybe a really bad mold issue or something like that, they can disclose it here, and after the closing of the property, they're not liable or as liable for anything that goes wrong with it. And I'm going to pass this around and just let you come through it. It's pretty detailed, and it's something that you really have to go through if you're selling property. The first thing I'm going to talk about as far as environmental concerns is heavy metals. There are a lot of heavy metals out there that can cause problems to family members, especially. What?
Oh, I just had to.
Okay. Sorry. Especially if you have children. I mean, children developing, if they're exposed to heavy metals, there are a lot of problems that can happen. So if you do have children and you do have an older house, it's something that you should be concerned with. The first thing is arsenic. There are a lot of places, especially in Old Town, in and around that area in the south. What is it, Whidbey Island? Not Whidbey Island. What island is that? Vashon. Yeah, that are actually part of the Superfund project with the SARCO. And through about 100 years of wind and rain and arsenic smoke, a lot of the property has been contaminated by arsenic. And there's actually a cleanup right now. So if you live in that area, you can actually go in and have that have the removal paid for. And this is the EPA's site. I'm going to pass this around. It's a little bit small, so if you have glasses, good luck with it. Anyway, there are areas where if you do live there and you do have a yard and it hasn't been renovated, chances are that some of the dust there might have some arsenic in it. And arsenic, just sitting there is not really going to mess with you too much. But if you disturb it, that's when it's going to mess with you. It gets in your system, and if you have a kid that has a propensity to eat dirt, which it happens.
Asbestos kind of that way.
Yeah, asbestos is coming up too. But anyway.
What about all those new condominiums on the north end that they're putting fire?
All been cleaned up.
Okay.
The EPA has a special fund called Superfund that allows for a process to get that all cleaned up. And most of the area down there has been renovated, cleaned up, and it's really nice, and people can live there now. But there are certain areas, pockets that have houses that maybe the people weren't concerned about, and nobody really did anything to them until now. So if you have one of those houses, or you have a friend, pass on the information, because a lot of people might not know about it.
Do you know very much about what that cleanup looks like? Like, do they actually take soil away?
Lots
and how deep do they go and all that?
They take samples. There is a real extensive process, and I was actually part of that process at the University of Washington back in the mid-'80s. We took extensive samples. We took water samples, we took soil samples. We actually went all the way up to Anacortes before we could get a clean sample with no arsenic.
Wow.
And it all depends on how deep it is. They remove a layer, and then they test, and then they remove another layer, and then they test. So they go down as far as it takes. And then finally they get to a place where they can just cover it up and it won't be an issue. And generally for a yard, they're gonna take the first 3 or 4 or 5 inches, and then they'll cover it with topsoil. And if you've already covered it with topsoil, even though there's arsenic underneath it, as long as you don't dig in it and disturb that dirt, it should be okay. Knock on wood.
Yeah.
Next thing is lead. Lead has been in our environment for at least 100 years now. If you're in an industrial area, there are a lot of places that are pretty heavily contaminated by lead. But inside your house, there are several areas that may or may not contain lead. If you have an old house, older than 1978, chances are there's been some lead-based paint painted on your house. For the most part, if it's been covered and undisturbed, there's really not too much of an issue. But if you have kids that have a propensity again for taking the chips and chewing on them, then you might have an issue. And arsenic and lead are very similar. One with cadmium, zinc, mercury is a different type of poison, as I can attest to. But most of those have really major concerns with development in children. But adults can also have the same problem, not necessarily developmental problems, but problems with your muscles, problems with your thinking, things like that. Lead can get in your system in lots of ways, more when you eat dirt. Number 2, there's dust all over the place. You always have dust in your house. And chances are that dust contains lead. I'd be willing to bet on it. In everybody's house, there's going to be a little bit of lead. We even, in a clean environment inside a laboratory, when I was doing lead analysis, if the custodian came in and did his sweeping without me noticing it, I had to stop him for 2 days because there was lead in the air and it contaminated it. Lead is in the automotive business, and especially before they changed to unleaded gasoline, this lead would come out your exhaust pipes and it would just filter out, come down the rain, and it's dust, and it's there, and it's always going to be there. And it just depends on where you are in your environment as to how much you're going to get exposed to. In your house, most of the lead is going to come from either that dust, not much of a big issue, but if you have an old house that has paint, and has chips, you might think it might be an issue. There is something, if you are going to sell an older house, this is called disclosure of information on lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards. And this is something that every homeowner has to sign if you're going to sell a house. That was passed 1978. I'll pass this around. It's kind of a catch-22 because 99% of the people out there don't have a clue about whether there's lead-based paint in their house or not. The other part of it is you may not want to know about it because after you find out about it, then you have to disclose it. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. If you do disclose it, then you're going to be responsible possibly for cleaning it up, and it's way more expensive. So you disclose that, you have it tested. If you have somebody come in and do some work on your house, do you have it tested first? It's kind of a double-edged sword because if you do find out that it's there along with asbestos too, then you're responsible for cleaning that up. If it's undisturbed, like if it's popcorn in your ceilings or something like that, it's okay. But if you disturb it, if there's some kind of a problem with peeling the paint off, then you might have a problem.
So if you already done over it, you didn't know if there was lead or not, and then you've been in the house 40 years, what do you do?
Stay there another 40 years. If it's undisturbed, chances are there's really not an issue. It's pretty obvious if you're having issues with lead. Back in the 80s and 90s, the big issue was glazing on the pottery. We brought it in from a different country. There was a lot of lead poisoning on people. And this goes back in history, all the way back to the Romans, because they had lead pipes. And the people that had all these baths, like in Italy and wherever they are, these people had a lot of lead poisoning.
There's a theory that lead is what led to the downfall of the Roman Empire, because a lot of the leaders poisoned their brains with too much lead intake, and You weren't thinking clearly.
Yeah, that was huge. And it was arsenic in Egypt because they wanted their face white and they wanted to preserve themselves, so they covered their faces with arsenic. And it did make them white, but it changed their life expectancy down to about 30 years. A lot of people died of arsenic poisoning back then. This is actually what we're required to give to people if they have an older house. This is something that the EPA put out, and it gives you information on lead-based paint, what can happen, what the symptoms are, things like that. So if you're a client of mine and you have an older house, this is what you get.
What's older house?
1978 and older. And you know something, it's kind of subjective because just because you have a house that was built in 1979 doesn't mean that a builder decided that they were going to use some old paint that was sitting around. So if you had a house that was built in 1980, there's still a possibility. Yeah, possibility it might have some lead-based paint. Chances are, you know, if you rub up against it and the paint comes off in your hand, that might be lead-based paint. If it's chipping off the side, that might be lead-based paint. It may or may not be. That's the appropriate terminology.
If magnets stick to your wall, is that lead-based paint?
If
magnets just stick,
you know,
doesn't stick to lead.
That's not magnetic.
Yeah, it's not
I
magnetic.
know.
It's kind of like.
It would have been a better joke if it was accurate. Thanks, man.
All right, so that's about it with lead. And I'm really disappointed because I had some photographs of asbestos I was going to bring in. And I may just do it the next time we meet, just so you guys have a good chance to look. I have some photographs.
The ones on the wall on your.
The ones on the wall in my house, yeah, only they're just 5x7.
Oh.
It gives you a chance to look at a 250 times magnification of what asbestos looks like. And I'll tell you what, when I had it under the microscope, when I looked at it, I held my breath, even though I knew I wasn't getting exposed to it. It's just some nasty stuff. If you put a piece of asbestos next to a piece of fibrous glass, it looks like a baseball bat right next to a whole bunch of hair. And it's just that big. And each one of those ends of the hair looks like that baseball bat again with a bunch of hair coming out the end of it. And it just goes on and on and on. And what happens is this stuff gets into the air. It's called friability. And if it's extremely friable, when you touch it, it just becomes airborne. And it doesn't necessarily go back down to the ground, it just kind of floats. So you can actually ingest that stuff even though you don't see it. And it's also in some water supplies too. Not to a major extent, it's something that generally isn't worrisome, so you don't have to, you know, test your water to see if there's asbestos on it. It is tested. There are a lot of companies who will do that for public water systems. So they test it maybe once a year, once every 6 months, and they'll run a whole bunch of water through a filter, and then they'll send it into the laboratory and count that. Asbestos.
Isn't it kind of hooks, or somehow it like hooks itself into your lung matter and
Yeah, and
you
I'll,
can't get it out?
I'm going to go into that a little bit. Yeah,
Oh, good.
You're right.
I wanted him to go into it. This is good.
The stuff that forms a problem is the stuff generally that's underneath your house on your pipes. And if you have a really, really old house, like built in the 1920s, 19-teens, right around in that, there was a lot of that. 1940s, there was a lot of it in the shipping businesses, especially if somebody was in the Navy. There were a lot of people that got exposed to it and got asbestosis and lung cancer. And that was a huge problem back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when these folks that were in that war or working in the ships started to have medical issues and started passing away from it. What happens is it gets into the air and you breathe it in. And the ends of it, you know, they're kind of like this. Here's the ends. I'm gonna bring the photographs next week, 2 weeks from now. And it gets into your lungs when you breathe it, and it just sticks there. And pretty soon, on the ends, your lung forms a little clot around it and starts growing and growing, and that's what turns into lung cancer eventually. And we unfortunately had to deal with a lot of that back in the 1980s and 90s when I was working on it. We actually had to look under microscopes about what it did to these folks' lungs. And it's just incredible. I mean, you think smoking is bad, this stuff is even worse. Generally in a house, you're not going to have to worry about it too much. It is a hazard. And if you do think that you have something like this in your house, I'd be glad to look at it for you. You know, I won't be able to tell you 100%, so you'll still have that little doubt. You know, do you know asbestos is there? Well, Luke said it could be there, but you're not 100% sure about it. But if it is there and it is something that I see as a concern, I'll let you know about it. And if it is a concern, you should pay the money to get rid of it. If it's in your wallboard or on your ceilings, paint over it, there's no big issue until you start scraping it off. You start scraping it off and you get dust, that's when you're gonna run into the problems. And with lead and with arsenic, if you do have a project that you're working on, if you're renovating something, tearing out walls, stuff like that, you have to have a specialist come in. They're specially trained to remove this stuff. They put plastic around it, and they have a clean area, and then another area that they have to clean themselves. 10 minutes, and I'm not even close. So, anyway, I'll wrap that up. Anyway, they have to clean that all up. They have to double bag it, and they have to bury it in a specific area. It has to be approved for that. Next is the good old meth lab. If you're Breaking Bad and you're putting meth into the air, I mean you're trying to make some meth, chances are everybody around you is going to know about it. The stuff they use to make meth, the volatile compounds is ether. It's the stuff that you spray in your carburetor to get your engine running. And this stuff is so volatile and so explosive that if you're within 100 feet of it, you're going to smell it, and it's going to bother you. Your eyes are going to hurt. Somebody lights a cigarette, things are going to explode. That's why you hear these things on the news. Meth lab exploded. Well, yeah, the idiot was high on his own stuff, and then he smoked a cigarette and it exploded. But anyway, once it's in a house, it's really tough to get out, unless it has been busted by the EPA. Nobody's going to know about it. But if it is busted, they do have a national register, and this is all of the houses in Washington that are on this national register. So I'm just going to
I
pass
think
that
there's a
around.
lot on these.
Yeah, there's a lot in Tacoma. So take a look at where you are and see if there's something close to you. And I'm going to not go into any more about that. Next is water wells. 1 minute left?
No, I wait till you finish. I just wanted to, the question was, maybe I missed it. That list, is it a valid number, or the authorities get the houses on the list?
This is from the EPA. This is from the federal meth lab list. If your house was a designated meth lab and busted by the EPA, it is on that list. If it wasn't busted, it's not on the list. And that's what you have to watch out for, because the ether will get into the walls and it will seep out if somebody did a real cheap job of covering it up. And if, once you move in and you start getting, headaches and your eyes hurt, that's a possibility that you have a meth lab in your house at some point in time. Either that, or there's maybe some formaldehyde in your carpet, or formaldehyde in your cabinets, or something like that. Just all sorts of things that could go wrong in the environment inside your house. The next thing is your water. Most people have public water. Public water is tested all the time. One of the labs that I used to work with, we would get samples in every month from every district, and we would certify them either good or not good, and if it's not good, then they have to do something about it, like coliform bacteria or something like that. And if you do have a home that is on a well, this is the little thing that they make you go into, and it's a well addendum, and it makes sure that the new owner goes in and is satisfied with the well being in the right condition. And I've actually seen wells that came out red. So you really have to worry about it if something like that happens.
So they make sure all is well, right?
All is well, yes, absolutely.
Well, I replaced the water heater in our house, and I called Rick because, when I took it to go recycle it at the dump, I threw it out of the truck, and it landed, and it started rolling. Like this blue goo came out of it. It's like, what is this? It's aluminum oxide.
Yeah, that's what you were saying.
Aluminum oxide, but so even if you're on the city water, it's a good idea to get it tested to find out what type of water you have, because there's different anode rods in water heaters, which anode rods go in water heaters, and they corrode before the water heater corrodes. That kind of code you have, stuff in the bottom of the boat to prevent the boat from deteriorating. But anyway, there's different kinds of anode rods, and that way you don't end up with a whole bunch of glue.
You don't want blue goo in your water.
Or like if you roll down a hill, do you seep out blue goo?
Yeah.
Too?
I was going past it, I was scared.
All right, I'm still about a third of the way through, and I got 5 minutes left. So, if you have a water well, you want to have it tested once in a while for coliform bacteria. And if you do end up with coliform bacteria, okay, put a little bit of bleach in your well. Let it sit there for a while. If you have other people on your well system, make sure they know not to drink it. Let it sit for a while, and then have everybody turn on their faucets for about an hour or so, and that cleans this stuff out. But generally, it can be rodents or something like that. But that's the general cause, just being inside your well house. So make sure your well house is well maintained and clean. Next will be the online sewage system, your septic system. If you don't have a septic system, sometimes you might have to worry about it if it's an old house. If you have trees growing over the top of your system, you may have roots that go in there and break into the old concrete pipes, and eventually that stuff is going to start backing up into your house. And it can be very smelly and very costly if that happens to you. You have to call Jackie, who's not here anymore. If you do have a septic system, if you want to sell that house, you have to have it inspected. You have to have it pumped by a company. They have to certify that it's in working condition, and then you have to have a health letter from the county. And it's different in each county. What they do in Pierce County is they send some dude out here with a yellow hat and a green shirt, and they look to see if there's the ground's been disturbed. And if it has been disturbed, they look at the O&E, the layout of what's on file, of how your septic system is and where the drain system is. And if that seems in working order and the paperwork from the septic pumping company is in order, then they rubber stamp it and send it off, and you're okay. Last thing, and I'm going to skip gases and pests. I'm going to go on to mold and mildew. Mold and mildew is a pretty big problem. Matter of fact, if I go into a house, our management says that if there's any kind of mold and mildew in there, that I need to just back off and it's an environmental hazard, and we need to call in specialists. I'm pretty knowledgeable about this stuff, so I don't mind talking about it. There probably are 150, 175 different types of mold. You can't get away from it. There's mold in here, you're breathing out mold spores. For the most part, it's just part of your environment. You breathe it in, breathe it out, and most people don't have an issue. If you go into a place that maybe is sat for a while and you smell that mold, chances are you're getting a pretty high concentration of it. Some people are allergic to it, some people aren't. And there are also one or two varieties that are very poisonous, and it can cause some really major problems with your system. And I think a few people have really gotten some bad sicknesses out of it. If you do have some mold, the best way to get rid of it is bleach. Bleach will kill anything. It'll kill mold, it'll kill viruses, it'll kill bacteria, just about everything, even at a concentration of about 10%. So if you want to get rid of mold and you have some there, if it's bad, put a respirator on or put a mask on, spray it with bleach, wipe it off. If there is a problem, generally it's associated with water being in your environment. Get a dehumidifier, stop any leaks that might be in your property, and warm it up a little bit. If it gets cold, then you're going to have some issues. If you've had a flood, if your property's been flooded, it's something that you really need to consider hiring a specialist to come out. What they generally do is they'll cut a hole just about maybe that far above where your flood was. They'll take the wallboard out, they'll take the insulation out, they'll spray it all down, they'll put new insulation, new wallboard in, spray on some anti-mold paint, and then you're good to go. But if you leave it there, chances are it's going to sprout something. And we saw that probably 20 years ago with the LP siding. If it wasn't attached, even though the siding was still good, if it wasn't attached properly, water got in there and it sprouted mushrooms and ruined the whole siding, and people ended up complaining about it, and it got to be a real big issue, and the state regulatory agencies got in on it, and people actually got refunds and settlements because of the LP siding. And we replaced a lot of siding back in maybe 10, 15 years ago. I think that's probably all I'm gonna talk about now. This is what the EPA has on molds. This is what we're supposed to give people if they do have a mold issue. So hand that around and open it up for questions.
You have a mold issue if your bread seems to mold in like 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, but you can actually sell that stuff. You can make it into penicillin and have a little black market out
That's
there.
what I tell you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's.
We can't eat it fast enough.
Yeah, you're not eating it fast enough. All bread has mold in it, and it actually is not that bad. I mean, once in a while I'll get something, I'll just cut it off. I mean, it's not something that you're probably gonna.
You don't know my wife, the whole boat goes.
Okay, well, yeah, yeah. Well, I'm a bachelor, so if it's, if it's only moldy on this half is still okay.
I'm eating, man.
Just extra peanut butter on that part.
I'm sorry, it degraded there.
Yeah, I've got a question. What's the responsibility of a landlord as far as their cleanup in the state of Washington? If there's mold in the house of a renter?
The landlord is responsible for certain things. If they do have an issue with mold, you are responsible to tell your landlord you have a mold issue. And they're responsible for coming by and taking care of that. If they don't take care of that, and I'm not 100% sure who you would contact, but there are agencies you can contact and say, listen, I've got a mold issue, my landlord isn't doing anything. Maybe it's the Department of Health, I'm just not sure. But there are ways for you to get that taken care of, and it is the landlord's responsibility, so they do have a liability if they just leave it there. And it's the same thing with lead-based paint and asbestos and things like that. They're responsible for letting people know that it may or may not be an issue.
For letting people know.
Yeah, when in doubt, tell people about it. That's the best way to keep yourself out of trouble. Anybody else? Okay,
That's good stuff.
thank you guys.
Yeah.